Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So this video is in response to young Pharaoh. He did a video about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and his main point was that the civil rights movement was a failure. And he also cited several examples to bring home that point. And I'm going to respond to some of the examples that he provided. But before I do so, I'm just going to provide a general response. The civil rights movement was not a failure. Although we are not in an equal and just society, this is not an egalitarian society by any stretch of the imagination. We are nowhere near becoming a post-racial society. We still have to acknowledge the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. If it wasn't for the civil rights movement, we would still be sitting at the back of the bus. If it wasn't for the civil rights movement, we would still be drinking from the colored fountain. If it wasn't for the civil rights movement, we would still see those signs that say no coloreds allowed. We wouldn't be able to eat at certain restaurants. We wouldn't be able to stay in certain hotels. We would be forced to live out our lives as second-class citizens if it wasn't for the civil rights movement. We would still be living at a time where a white man could literally lynch a black man and there be no justice. Hang a black man from a tree and there is no justice. Abduct a black boy and lynch that black boy. Beat him beyond recognition and throw him in some creek or river and there be black witnesses to the abduction and there is no justice. That's what existed during Jim Crow era. Although we are nowhere near being a perfect society or equal society, we are not where we were during Jim Crow. We didn't have the right to vote under Jim Crow. If a black man or black woman tried to vote, they were persecuted. They were beaten and killed by terrorist groups like the KKK. We no longer live under those conditions. We no longer have to face literacy tests in order to vote. We no longer have to deal with poll taxes. We no longer have to suffer through those kind of conditions. We are no longer prevented from voting. We have certain rights in this country. Because of the Civil Rights movement, we have a Voting Rights Act, we have a Civil Rights Act, we have a Fair Housing Act. Because of the Civil Rights movement, we were able to achieve victories in the courtroom, able to achieve victories like Brown versus the Board of Education, ending legalized segregation, putting an end to the doctrine of separate but equal. If it wasn't for the Civil Rights movement, we would not have an increase in the number of black elected officials in this country. Today we have black mayors, we have black city council people, we have black congressmen, we have black senators, and we even had a black president because of the civil rights movement. We are able to enact legislation that is beneficial to black communities because of the civil rights movement. Because of the civil rights movement, we have more black people who are graduating from colleges, more educated black people, more middle-class black people than we had before the civil rights movement. The poverty rate has decreased since the civil rights movement. So in many ways, in many measurable and tangible ways, the civil rights movement was a success. So I think that we need to quit exaggerating by saying that it wasn't a success. Before the civil rights movement, black people could be lynched and there would be no justice. Literally lynched. A black boy could be beaten beyond recognition and have his body thrown in a creek simply for whistling at a white girl. That's what happened under Jim Crow. Black people could be lynched for trying to vote. Black people could be brutalized and killed just for trying to teach their people to register to vote. Black people were killed over those things. We no longer face those kind of threats. We no longer live under those kind of conditions. So obviously, the civil rights movement had major successes. Of course, the civil rights movement continues today. We have modern issues that we're dealing with, obviously. We still have problems of voter suppression. We have problems of police brutality. We have problems of mass incarceration. We have continuing problems, but we cannot deny the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. We cannot express such ingratitude to those who fought for our liberation. Those like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his life so that we could have freedom in this country, so that we could be able to exercise citizenship rights in this country. So I just had to begin with that. I mean, I just think that it is an exaggeration to say that the civil rights movement was a failure. Now, in young Pharaoh's video, he compared Martin Luther King Day to Thanksgiving. You know, he talked about how the government killed Martin Luther King, and then after the government killed him, they created a holiday for him. And he's compared that to Thanksgiving, you know, where you had these people, these Europeans, kill the native people, you know, take the native people's land and then create some holiday celebrating that. First of all, I'll say this. We don't have Martin Luther King Day because the government was just generous and decided to create the day, to create the holiday. That's not why we have Martin Luther King Day. That holiday was created as a result of struggle. Our people pushed for that holiday. Our people lobbied for that holiday. So this is not a situation where this white man decided to create something. We lobbied and we pushed for that holiday to acknowledge the sacrifice of that brother. And not only to acknowledge his sacrifice, but to acknowledge the sacrifice of a movement for freedom, a movement for justice, a movement for equality. So that's the first point that I had to respond to from his video. Another point that I have to respond to is this notion that we sacrificed our independence in order to integrate. You know, so that was another point that Pharaoh made. He was basically saying, well, we gave up our independence in order to become a part of somebody else's society. During the Jim Crow era, we did not have independence. I mean, I think that a lot of times people have these romantic notions of life under Jim Crow. You know, they have these fantasies of black people being independent and great under Jim Crow. When the fact of the matter is, black people were not independent under Jim Crow. Black people were oppressed under Jim Crow. And I cited the examples before. You know, a situation where black people could be lynched and there'd be no justice. Where a black person walking down the street, if he was in front of some white people, he would have to cross and walk on the other side of the street. That's how black people lived under Jim Crow. They lived under a time where you couldn't even look a white man in the eyes in the South. And if you did, you had to face retaliation. That's what Jim Crow was really like, where a black man was castrated literally and figuratively, deprived of his manhood, where he wasn't able to deal with this white man as an equal human being. He had to look down when addressing a white man. He had to deal with white men calling him boy. Does that sound like independence to you? And when we did manage to create our own businesses, those segregationists, those racists destroyed many of those towns. We know what happened to Black Wall Street. We know what happened to other towns that black people built that were burned to the ground. So we obviously were independent. Segregation is not independence. It's not independence when your children are forced to go to inferior schools with less resources, with falling apart, dilapidated buildings, with few books and other resources. That's not independence. That is not what independence looks like. So people have to get rid of these fantasies of independence during Jim Crow. They have to get rid of this ridiculous notion that somehow black people were living in a utopia under Jim Crow. We were oppressed brutally under Jim Crow. Have you forgotten about the police, how they treated black people during those times? If we think today is bad, that is nothing compared to what our mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers and fathers faced, where they would literally beat black people and nothing would happen. They would send dogs to rip the flesh off of black people. They would hose our people down, lock our people up just for trying to demand their human and civil rights in this country. And that's your idea of black people being independent? We weren't choosing to abandon independence in order to integrate. That's not what the civil rights movement was about. They were fighting for their basic human rights, their basic human dignity. They were fighting for the right to be treated as a man, as a human being, instead of being treated like an animal. So I had to address that point. And then Pharaoh made some points about how the civil rights movement allowed racism to become classism. And that's not a function of the civil rights movement. What that is an evolution of racism. Of course, racism has morphed and it has changed and it is adopted to different conditions and times. And that's a real problem that needs to be addressed. But that is not the fault of the civil rights movement. You know, the examples you cited about black people no longer being able to afford to live in certain neighborhoods as a way to, that's a way of discriminating against black people, or, people being racially profiled for how they dress or being in a certain affluent neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. Those are modern day examples of racism. But to blame those modern day examples of racism on the civil rights movement is preposterous. It's blaming the victim for what his victimizer does. That's what it is. That's essentially what it is. Now, another point that Pharaoh made was this. He said that now black people under integration, instead of building up their community, what they do is when they get a little bit of money and some success, they abandon the community and they go live in a predominantly white suburb. And he basically talked about how that's undermining the black community. And I understand the point that he's making. I think that that's, there's some validity to that point. I do think that we need to give back to our communities and try to build our communities. But at the same time, I understand the frustration of those who leave the community. And I'll explain why I say that. Because many of these communities are communities that are suffering. They're suffering from high crime rates, which is linked to high poverty rates and failing schools. Many of these communities are flooded with illegal guns and drugs, creating an environment that is ripe for violence, that's ripe for certain types of crimes. And when somebody has the option to either continue to live in such an environment or to go elsewhere to an environment that's more prosperous with more opportunities such as better education, better schools for their children, safer streets where they don't have to fear being killed or being hit with a stray bullet or having to deal with drug addicts who are wandering about like zombies. I understand why some of our people abandon those conditions to go to the suburbs. And I get it. But at the same time, I understand what young Pharaoh is talking about in terms of us having a commitment to our community. I think that those people who obtain education, who become successful in life, they have a moral obligation to give back to the community in many kinds of ways. By being a mentor, by making donation to various causes in the community to help uplift the community, and by helping to create business opportunities for people in the community. I think that we need to do that. I think that we need to be the ones to rebuild our community instead of allowing others to come in and gentrify the community. And then once they come in and improve the community or gentrify it, we want to complain instead of us getting together our resources and rebuilding our communities. So I understand what the brother is saying, and I think that more of us do need to be committed to rebuilding our communities. But at the same time, I understand the frustration. I understand the the outrage that people have. They can't afford to wait around for generations for a community to turn around when they have children that they're trying to raise in a safe and healthy environment. So I get that. And I have no problem with people exercising their civil right to live wherever they want to live. You shouldn't be confined to some area simply because of the color of your skin. So, those are my thoughts about that. And then there's a couple of other points that I want to make before I close. Now, he talked about how you had some of these people that fought for equal rights and so-called integration, and then afterwards they no longer pursued that. Instead, they taught their children not to become police officers or firemen. Instead, a lot of people became wrapped up in illegal life, like becoming drug dealers and all that kind of stuff. So that's one point that he makes. And, I think overall, I'll say this, I don't think that that's valid because you have plenty of black people in our community who are police officers and who are firemen and all that kind of stuff. And I do think that we need more black police officers. We need more black elected officials because as long as we are outside of the process, we are unable to influence what happens. As long as we are not in positions of leadership in police departments, we're not able to create the change that we want to see. As long as we are not voting for candidates and running for office or helping to elect progressive politicians, we won't see any changes in our community. So I think that in that sense, we do have to play a bigger role in the community on the most basic levels, like being involved in, like people becoming police officers and trying to create change, or people helping to elect a mayor that will appoint the right police chief that understands the values of the community. Also, I mean, we need to have people in positions of power and influence in corporate America as well. So we need to take advantage of all the opportunities presented to us. We need to help shape corporate America, the government, and all facets of society. We need to exercise influence in every aspect of the society instead of sitting on the outside and complaining about how things are working. Because, as I pointed out in my other video about black separatism is a fantasy, the fact of the matter is the majority of black people are not going to some separate nation anytime soon. We are going to be living in America, and it's our job to make sure that this country in which we live protects our civil rights and our human rights. And the only way that that's going to happen is if we fight for our rights and we demand our rights. It's not going to happen by giving some speeches or wishful thinking. It's through struggle. That's how you bring about change.